want just to say that I call you to find, at the end, a win-win solution for Greece and for the European Union. And I want to go further on that, just to say that, of course, we have the tradition in Belgium to discuss for a long period of time before to put into place a government, to put into place a coalition. So we have followed the process in Greece. It was very rapid, in fact, after the elections. And then we have seen the first weeks and first months in office, and now we try to see if it's possible to go further in the negotiations with the European Union. I want just to say that for Belgium, it's quite important to find a way to give more time to Greece, to give maybe a lower level of interest rate, because I fully understand that to pay more than 5% when some country like Belgium have the opportunity to receive the proposal of negative interest rate, there's some room for maneuver. But of course, we try to see if it's possible to do that with some commitment coming from Greece. And so I will be very pleased to listen from you about your vision about the possible proposal from Greece. I want just to add that to us it's also important to strengthen the economic and monetary union, and maybe more inside the Eurozone if it's possible than outside, and with, if it's possible, all the partners in the Eurozone. And so we try to go to a better convergence, not only on taxations, economic issues, on fiscal issues, but also on social issues. And I'm sure that we will find a way to fight against social dumping, but to organize a real mobility on the labor market. But we need also to have common standards. And if it's possible to have a better convergence, at the end, it will be possible maybe to discuss about a more political union. But that is for the next business summit. Maybe today it will be too early to speak about a so-called federal union at the European level. But thanks again for your presence, not only today, but all the time now in Brussels for so many meetings. And we are very pleased to listen from you about your vision, not only about the Greece policy, but maybe also about the negotiations and the discussion with the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Reynders, for the gracious introduction. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Thanks to Sean for moderating what I hope is going to be a modest vision of how Greece can recover in a Eurozone that is consolidating. In a Eurozone that is mending its various design faults and working towards integration, as is our duty to Europeans and to our European common history. Today, all eyes are on two processes. The British election is one of them, and the negotiations that are unfolding here in Brussels between our team and the technocratic staff from European institutions and the International Monetary Fund, I should say. Now, interestingly, both processes, the electoral one in Britain and then a continuing negotiation, the Greek saga, if you want to call it that, are unfolding and contain the seeds of potential fragmentation of the European Union. I believe it is crucial to find ways of preventing such fragmentation at both ends of the continent. If we fail, history will pass a deservedly harsh judgment upon all of us. So, let me focus on the one of the two processes, the one that I'm qualified to speak about. The negotiations happening close by, here in Brussels, over the Greek loan agreement and its conditionalities. Now, months of negotiations have already happened, ever since our government was elected in late January, and they have produced no agreement as yet. Now, I trust that an agreement will be in the offing in the next days, mostly weeks. However, while we are confident of such an agreement, it is particularly useful to ask, why has it taken so long? Fruitless recriminations aside, one tangible reason that I want to put to you is that all sides, our side, the other side, have been focusing too much on the strings to be attached to the next liquidity injection to the Greek economy, and not sufficiently on a vision of how Greece can recover and develop sustainably. This is why I think it is important to visualize a recovery in Greece within a changing Eurozone. Not only is there a pressing need to come up with such a blueprint for Greece's recovery, but additionally, this commonly agreed blueprint may, just may, prove a catalyst that unlocks not only the present impasse between the institutions and Greece, but also several impasses within the Eurozone itself. So let me go back to the question. Why has white smoke not emerged from the Brussels group yet? Why don't we have an agreement? We should have had one some time ago. And I'm saying that we should have had it because there is plenty of common ground between our government and the institutions. We agree that Greece should never have to borrow again in order to pay our way, in order to pay for our pensions and salaries. We agree that public debt needs to be managed and reconfigured. We agree that Greece's tax system needs to be revamped and the revenue authorities, our tax office, must be freed from all political but also corporate influence. We agree that the pension system is ailing. We agree that the economy's credit sector, our banking sector, is not functioning properly, in the sense that it fails to provide credit even to profitable firms. We agree that the labour market has been devastated by years of crisis and is deeply segmented, with productivity growth having stalled. We agree that public administration in Greece is in urgent need of modernization and public resources must be used more efficiently. We agree that overwhelming obstacles block the formation of startups, digital companies, since this is the theme of this fine conference. And generally there are impediments to entrepreneurship in Greece. Competition in product markets is far too circumscribed. We agree, I believe we agree on this, that inequality in Greece has reached outrageous levels, preventing society from uniting behind a reform agenda. And finally, I also think we agree that oligarchic interests rule supreme in Greece and have done for a while, and act as a brake on growth, causing resentment that makes reform very difficult. So we agree on all this. Now, this consensus aside, agreement on a new developmental model for Greece, a blueprint for a recovery in Greece, requires that we overcome two important hurdles. First, we must concur on how to approach Greece's fiscal consolidation path and how to manage our public debt. Secondly, we need a comprehensive, commonly agreed reform agenda that will underpin this fiscal consolidation path and inspire the confidence of Greek society on the one hand and of our partners on the other. Now, beginning with fiscal consolidation, there is an important issue and a problem here. Traditionally, since 2010, since Greece exited the markets and entered into its loan agreement, the institutions have relied on what I call a process of backward induction. They set a date. I made it work. Success. So, backward induction means something simple. You start at some future point in time, let's say 2019, and you say, okay, now my debt is around 180% of GDP, I want to bring it down to less than 140%. Now, what do I need to do this in terms of predicting GDP growth, the primary balance, the primary surplus, how much proceeds from privatization am I going to get, and you work backwards and you work out, for instance, that during this period you need a primary surplus of 20% for this period. Now, the problem with this backward induction technique is that there is what we in economics refer to as dynamic inconsistency. At least that's my view, and I'm putting it to you. In order to produce a primary balance of 20% over those years, just by announcing that this is what you're intending to extract this large proportion of GDP from the economy in the form of excess taxes, in a sense. What you're doing is you're undermining your assumption that GDP growth will be to 27%. And then, as the years go by, you fail in both targets. And then, Another Eurogroup comes when Greece's path is considered to have been a failure. But that was a designed failure just because backward induction cannot produce the right dynamic path for a country that is caught up in a debt deflationary cycle. Now, this is what I call an austerity trap. And we need to exit this in order to stop coming back to the same problem of a failed fiscal path. Now, our position is that instead of backward induction, we should map out a forward-looking plan based on reasonable assumptions about the primary surpluses that are consistent with healthy growth rates, net investment, export and expansion, all these factors that can and should stabilize Greece's economy and debt ratio. If this means that the debt to GDP ratio will not be 120% by 2020, so be it. We better start dealing with the facts and with feasible paths. Now, besides convincing our partners that our debt sustainability analysis should avoid the austerity trap, we, the Greek government, must overcome a second hurdle. We have to come up and agree with our institutions and with the institutions and our partners on a reform agenda which is not of the sort whose announcement turns the Greek population against us. Greeks must own the reform agenda, and they didn't in the years that passed. The fact that the previous 5 years of that particular fiscal consolidation plan and that particular reform agenda has failed is beyond dispute. Let me just give you a very quick picture here that captures the relationship between structural deficit reduction and nominal GDP changes. You can see quite clearly that Greece is a frightful outlier. We had the largest structural deficit reduction in the history of capitalism. And the result has quite predictably been a major loss of income. Now, if we had no debt, then that would have been a simple case of internal devaluation. But when you have a debt in euros and your euro income is shrinking the way you see on this card, then effectively the insolvency gets worse. The more you try to reduce deficits, the greater your debt to GDP ratio because the denominator, which is GDP, shrinks. If you want another picture that reveals the failure of the previous program, here it is. What you will see is that while we had the largest decline of wages in Europe, and indeed beyond Europe, our export growth has been flat. That should give us pause. That should give us cause for concern. Because when wages come down by that much and exports don't grow, you know that something has broken down. And what is it? What is it that has broken down? Investment and credit. You can't grow and you can't have export-led growth if even export-oriented firms have access to neither credit nor to investment. And this is something we need to fix. 5 years of this debt deflation have decimated both investment and credit. But let's move beyond this. Imagine a development bank that levers up collateral comprising the equity the state shall retain after privatizations, as well as other assets, real estate, for instance, whose value can be easily enhanced through reforming property rights. Imagine that it links up the European Investment Bank, the Juncker Plan, with Greece's private sector. Privatization suddenly escapes any association with fire sales and becomes part of a grand developmental public-private partnership. Imagine further a bad bank that helps the banks shed their legacy non-performing mortgages, unclogging in the process their financial plumbing. Now, in concert with the development bank's virtuous impact, credit and investment flows will flood the hitherto arid realms of Greece's economy, eventually helping the bad bank turn a profit, and indeed turning into a good bank. So we need a development bank that is linked to the privatization process and which uses as collateral public assets that have been developed, and we need a bad bank that unclogs the banking system. The way to do this, of course, is to involve the Hellenic Financial Stability Facility and the capital that remains there for the purposes of recapitalizing and declogging the banking system. But we need a lot more than that. What we need, in addition, of course, is serious reform at the level of the real economy. The government is considering very seriously, and it is proposing as we speak to our partners, to deregulate the market for natural gas, to consider the French bilateral contracts model in the regulation of the electricity power and distribution sector, without, however, privatizing the existing power generating company, to deregulate product specifications, for instance, in dairy market, in non-prescription pharmaceuticals, to simplify massively business licensing in association with the World Bank, to legislate for the inclusion of all discounts into retailers' invoices in order to shrink price-cost margins, particularly in supermarket chains, to strengthen our competition commission and empower it with its own budget in order to do and carry out its job properly. On labor markets, there's a lot of talk about Greek labor markets. So let me give you some data on this. That doesn't fit in quite nicely within the Washington consensus of yesteryear. Recent estimates put up to 1/3 of all paid labor, the informal labor category. Undeclared labor comes up to 1/3 of all paid labor. Now, if one adds to this the fact that less than 10% of unemployed workers have ever received a single euro of unemployment benefit, it is clear, ladies and gentlemen, that the Greek labor market is more deregulated than most other European labor markets. Further reductions in worker protection will not benefit high-quality employers who need a level playing field, because they currently have to compete with employers that are unscrupulous and who employ undeclared labor. In short, the labor market needs regulation to formalize the informal labor force with positive externalities for pension funds and government revenues. The only way pension funds can be refloated is if undeclared labor is formalized and if growth comes to increase employment. Of course, we need a lot of other reforms with the pension system, but that is the main game. We also need, at least this is what our government believes, in conjunction with the International Labour Organization and using best practice models from the rest of Europe, to redesign a fair and efficient system of collective bargaining that gives voice to workers and helps in converting informal to formal labour. Turning just once more to the pension system, let me give you a quite astonishing figure. Some of you may know it, most of you don't. In 2012, when we had the haircut called euphemistically PSI, private sector involvement, we're very good in Europe with euphemisms, right? 26 billion was haircut from the pension funds, who were forced by law to keep their reserves in Greek government bonds, which were haircut. 26 billion. At the same time, because of the crisis, pension funds lost 1/3 of contributions due to the collapse of declared paid employment. Since 2012, up to 44% of private sector pensions have been cut. We had a 44% cut. And in the public sector, up to 48%. So as a result, the average pensioner in Greece is now €1 above the poverty line. The official poverty line, which as we all know in Europe, is 60% of median average income. Now it is obvious that only, as I said before, a return to a job-rich growth spurt can render it sustainable again, and any attempt to cut pensions now, today, in order to balance the books of the pension funds, would lead to further pauperization, greater estrangement of large parts of the population, and another twirl of the debt deflationary spiral. Of course, this does not mean that we should not reform the pension system that we have. This is why we are proposing, as I speak, here in Brussels, that we should curtail seriously early retirements, that we should consolidate smaller funds and merge them, and that we should possibly consider the use of methods for squeezing, if we need to squeeze pensions, from the top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. Now, can anyone, in this day and age when all headlines are full of awful news about Greece, can anyone imagine Greece recovering strongly? Let me argue that if we put together this reform package that includes public investment, private investment or credit, labor markets, product markets, as well as social security funds, with the development banks' dividends flowing into social security funds in order to refloat them. I suggest to you that in a world of ultra-low returns and interest rates, Greece, just the announcement of such a package and an agreement with the institutions will suddenly emerge or be seen as a splendid investment opportunity, causing a steady stream of foreign direct investment to flow inwards. As the overly negative expectations turn positive, the problem will be to contain irrational exuberance. The danger will be that of a repetition of the capital flows that we had before 2008. That era that ended up or was characterized by debt-fueled growth, Ponzi growth, as I like to put it. This time it must be different. To ensure that this time it is different, Greece will need to reform its social economy and its political system. Ladies and gentlemen, creating new bubbles, reminiscent of the bubbles of the pre-2008 period, is not our government's idea of development. During Greece's era of debt-fueled growth, before 2008, from the late 1990s to 2008, capital flows were channeled by commercial banks into a frenzy of consumerism and by the state into an orgy of unlawful procurement and general profligacy. This time we are determined it will be different. The new development bank that we're thinking of will take the lead in targeting scarce homegrown resources. Remember, we're going to be using our own assets to lever them up for the purposes of creating investment flows. Those will be channeled into selected productive investments in startups, in IT companies that make use of the very rich local human capital that we have in Greece, organic agro, small and medium-sized enterprises, export-oriented pharmaceutical companies, means of attracting the international film industry to Greek locations. Why not? We have the locations, I can assure you. Educational programs that take advantage of Greek intellectual production and unbeatable historical sites, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, the regulatory authorities will be keeping a watchful eye over commercial lending practices, and we are very keen to introduce a debt brake or a deficit brake that will prevent our government from re-indulging into bad old habits, ensuring that our state never again slips into primary deficits. Cartels, anti-competitive invoicing practices, senselessly closed professions, and a bureaucracy that has traditionally turned the state into public enemy number one will soon discover that our government is hell-bent on attacking them. Greece's development has in the past been arrested by the unholy alliance between oligarchic vested interests and political parties, scandalous procurement, clientelism, the permanently insolvent media, the accommodating, in inverted commas, banks, weak tax authorities, and a snowed-under, fear-stricken judiciary. Only the bright light of democratic transparency and efficient government can dissolve this dark alliance. Our government is determined to help it shine through. So let me now start wrapping up by referring to what I consider to be, what we consider to be, the elements of an agreement between us and the institutions. Firstly, the reform package. We have to come up with a sensible, forward-looking, not backward inductions induced DSA, debt sustainability analysis, and fiscal path. We need to mobilize public assets through privatizations, the way we understand privatizations, that is not fire sales in the middle of a recession that has led to the collapse of the assets prices, but by putting emphasis on the bidder's minimum commitment to investment and also retaining an equity stake for the state in order to put it into the development bank that I was referring to before. We need serious revamping of our VAT system. Let me give you just an example. Last year in Mykonos, in Santorini, we had an almost doubling of tourism and a reduction in the take from VAT. This is a shameful outcome. So we need both to revamp the rates of VAT in a way that does not jeopardize the living standards of those, especially on the islands, who find it very hard to cope, but also in a way that maximizes collectability and spreads the costs, especially to those who deserve to have the cost spread towards them. We need, and this is a major move by any Greek government. Our government has taken the very bold step of recommending and putting forward the idea that we should create an utterly independent, self-governed, IRS-like tax commission, a commission for taxes and customs. As the Minister of Finance, I do not want to have political influence over the means by which taxes are collected, but I also want to ensure that the corporate sector doesn't have any undue influence over the same process. Pension reform, we're, as I said before, particularly interested in preventing a process which has been quite detrimental for pension funds over the last few years, where, for instance, in particular in the banking sector, employees in their mid-50s are being pushed by banks towards the pension system so as to be shifted away from the bank's payroll at the expense of the pension funds. We want to look at ways in which the pension system can be modernized. And of course, we need to reform the judiciary. Let me just give you a very simple example. If there is a dispute between the state and a business person, the court case will be heard in 2023. That has to end, because such a failure of the judicial system is dynamite in the capacity of the government, of any government, not just our government, to create a system that will eat into the huge arrears that we're facing, tax arrears, especially from the business sector. And now, let me move on to elements of an agreement beyond the June deadline, the June expiry date of the current loan arrangement that we have with institutions and the Eurozone. I believe it's essential that we should include in the business plan, the blueprint for beyond June, a major investment package for Greece. Not for the Greek state. The Greek state should not be in the business of channeling investments. The fiscal space we have is utterly limited, but some combination of the European Investment Bank, perhaps in association with the European Central Bank, which, as we all know, is buying EIB bonds, could create an injection into the private sector of Greece, particularly the export-oriented companies that have a good track record. And in conjunction, of course, with the development bank that we want to create. Secondly, we have to have some sensible management of our debt. The Deputy Prime Minister valiantly mentioned this point. I want to just make some remarks on this that are helpful in the conversation. Take, for instance, the legacy Greek government bonds, pre-2012 Greek government bonds that the ECB purchased under the stewardship of Mr. Trichet. There is still 27 billion left. If those bonds had not been purchased by the ECB, they would have now been haircut almost 90% in present value terms. There must be some way of swapping new Greek government debt for that legacy debt so as to prevent the rather weird situation where we have now to borrow from our partners in order to repay the central bank for a monetary operation of the central bank at the time when the central bank is printing 1 trillion euros. There must be a smart way of ensuring that the ECB gets its money back, so that its charter regarding monetary financing is respected, while at the same time we have a smoothing out of debt management through clever swaps. We could have a degree of linkage between the interest rate that we're repaying with our growth rate of nominal gross domestic product, so as to create an incentive compatibility so that our partners, Belgium for instance, but other countries that are poorer than Greece, like Slovakia for instance, can get more money the more we grow. And that way, it's like a declaration to the world that Europe now is a family working together. These are just some examples. And finally, I think that we would all agree that wherever it happens in Europe, wherever poverty rises its ugly head, giving rise to misanthropy, even to neo-Nazism, an anti-poverty drive is in the interests of everyone. So let me come to my conclusion. Now, let us for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, imagine an announcement of such a package. I suggest that the shares of our banks will begin skyrocketing, our state's losses from their recapitalization of the banks will be extinguished very quickly, the dividends of a development bank will refloat the pension funds. Suddenly, a society mired in debt deflation and rendered unreformable by the previous program will be on the mend and ready to embrace as its own this new reform package. So my question is, what do you believe, ladies and gentlemen, is in Europe's best interests? What would help Europe consolidate in the future? A Greek and utopian failure to implement this blueprint, leading us all to a dystopian, uncharted territory? Or the successful implementation of a program like this, of a blueprint of this nature? I shall leave it to you to decide. For my part, I shall conclude with what I consider to be a triptych of dangerous myths that is placing the Eurozone, and of course Greece, in great peril unnecessarily. The first myth is that the Greek exit from the Eurozone may be good for the Eurozone and even for Greece. It is a myth. That Greece has not done enough during the last 5 years and insists on having other nations, some of them poorer than itself, paying for our pensions and salaries. It is a myth. That the new government has not negotiated in good faith, has tabled no serious proposals to the institutions, and has no credible plan for helping the Greek economy stand on its own 2 feet within the Eurozone. Ladies and gentlemen, none of this is correct. Firstly, a Greek failure, even if it is at first contained by an activist central bank, will render the Eurozone similar to the mid-war gold standard, a hard money fixed exchange rate regime that jettisons economies bearing the greatest burden of fiscal adjustments. And once this realization enters the hearts and minds, it is only a matter of time before the Eurozone will fragment, with enormous costs for every European nation. As for Greece, a forced exit, any exit, will cause the pauperization of another 1 million Greeks, as if the current poverty crisis is not enough. Secondly, the notion that Greece has not done enough to consolidate its public finances is absolute historical nonsense. You saw the diagram. We've done more structural deficit reduction than any country in the last 300 years, at least in time of peace. As we saw, no economy has consolidated more. And presently, even under the very difficult conditions we find ourselves in at the moment, through this liquidity squeeze that you're all familiar with, we're still running a primary surplus. And we are committed to a deficit break so that we will always run a primary surplus. So the claim that the Greek state requires loans in order to pay for pensions and for salaries is simply wrong. The Greek government has been also arguing since the 20th of February, that's a Eurogroup agreement on the 20th of February that I'm referring to, for immediate implementation of a number of important reforms. we wanted to start in March, not in May, not in June. Well, I'm happy to confirm that much progress is now being made here in Brussels in the context of the Brussels Club. Now, lastly, the blueprint, this blueprint that you kindly gave me the opportunity to present, to outline today, lays out a plan for investment-led recovery based on wide-ranging socioeconomic reforms that enhance liberty, justice, shared prosperity, and the idea that democracy can turn a vicious into a virtuous cycle. In 2010, our failures took a toll on Europe, Greece's failures. Now, if we succeed together in this project, a different process may unfold, with Greece being the harbinger of good things to come across Europe. Thank you.